Hello again, and it's good to be with you on this Thursday as we go through Matthew chapter 2 this week. So if you stop right here and go ahead and read Matthew chapter 2, that'd be the best thing to do. It's only 23 verses, so it'd be a pretty quick read. So go ahead and stop right here, read that chapter, and then come back and I'll discuss the chapter. Alright, so Matthew 2 is basically separated into 4 episodes. We have this episode where the Magi come to meet Herod, and I'll talk about this more. Then we have another, that's 2, 1 through 12, and then chapter 2, 13 through 15 is escape basically from Herod's murderous intent, his infanticide in Bethlehem, and then you have 16 through 18 where actually the infanticide occurs, where Herod actually goes in and kills all of the infants in Bethlehem from 18 months and younger, or 2 years and younger, 2 years and younger. And then after that you have verses 19 through 23, and it's the beginning of basically of Jesus in Galilee. And Galilee ends up being a very important place for Jesus in his early ministry. So chapter 2, probably the idea behind chapter 2 is just to tell us how Jesus got to Galilee, or how his why he's there, why he began there, I guess. Galilee is very, very important in the early part of his ministry. Okay, now all this material in chapter 2 I find interesting because it's unique material to Matthew. Now, thinking about the Gospels, the Gospel of John is completely different than the other 3. So I'm not going to really talk about the Gospel of John. I just really want to talk about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those are what is called these 3 Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels. The idea of seeing the same story with the same eyes or something like that. They are different though. And Matthew and Luke basically follow Mark, except then they've added more material to their Gospels respectively. So this chapter 2 in Gospel of Matthew is all unique material. Luke doesn't share this. Mark doesn't have it. So it's quite interesting that Matthew put this in there. And again, then you have to think, well, why does he put all this material in chapter 2 itself? What's the purpose? What's his intent? Well, again, I think it is about Galilee, because that's where it closes at, basically, is that Jesus makes it to Galilee, or begins his life in Galilee, his infant life anyway, and up to his early adulthood. Up to the time he starts ministry, it seems like he's in Galilee. It's about all we know from Matthew. We don't know much else. But anyway, so that maybe that's the purpose of chapter 2 in the Gospel of Matthew, is just to tell us how Jesus began, why Jesus began his ministry in Galilee. Well, what was that all about? That's probably why all this unique material is found in the Gospel of Matthew itself. Now, so let's look at each episode. So the first episode is the encounter between Herod and the wise men. So chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. This is the longest episode in there. It's also, I think, probably the funniest. But anyway, we find out right off the bat that Jesus has already been born. So it's after the birth of Jesus, and the birth happened in Bethlehem. So this is where we find this out. Magi from the east come. We don't know how many magi. We know it's plural, so it's at least 2. It doesn't have to be 3. Even though there are 3 gifts, that doesn't mean anything. So we don't know. I would imagine it was probably less than 10, maybe. I don't know. It could have been more, but we don't know the exact number. All we know is it's more than 1. That's what we do know for sure. The thing about these magi, they're coming probably from the old Babylonian area. Remember, 600 years earlier, prior to the birth of Jesus, the Jewish people, this is one of the first times they're called Jewish people because they're tribe of Judah, were deported to Babylon. A lot of them were deported. And prior to that, the other tribes had been deported 700 years before the birth of Jesus. And that northern kingdom, which was called, ironically, Israel, basically vanished. But the nation of Judah, the southern kingdom, continued. Well, they were deported into Babylon. So these magi that are coming from the east probably are Jewish people. They're not pagans. They're probably Jewish people. There was a large Jewish population in the old Babylonian region. It became the Persian Empire. Persian Empire is basically dissolved at this time, the time of Jesus. But there's another empire over there called the Parthian Empire. But it's just a conglomerate of a lot of old empires that have been subjected to this greater authority or whatever. But anyway, the old Babylonian region is in this area. So they're coming from that area. Probably Jewish. In fact, in the book of Daniel and his friends, that's all it says. I'm assuming that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those four, I know for sure, were included in the classification of wise men in Babylon. So Daniel and his friends, these three, were considered magi. This is where we get the word from, magi. It's from the Greek, basically. But they were considered this also. And so they're aware of something that's about to happen, or should happen anyway, and they're coming to find out. They see the star. They want to worship. So they have to have some kind of an idea that this has something to do with, God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, in a sense. So I think they're Jewish people. They're coming from the old Babylonian area, Mesopotamia, and they're coming to worship. Now, this star, they saw the star and it triggered something. There probably was some kind of celestial event going on. And I'm sure there's people that probably have figured out exactly what it was going on. I didn't care to look that up. But anyway, they see this and they start coming. Now, this visit, here's another thing that's interesting. We move back and forth in time in chapter 2. So, initially, we're at the after the birth of Jesus. That's about all we can say. Now, when the Magi come to Herod, and with what happens afterward, we can assume that we're probably in at least 1 year to 2 years after the birth of Jesus. So there's been a little bit of time that's transpired. So it's after the birth of Jesus. I know this because of the death decree that Herod puts out for the killing of the infants 2 years and younger. So it must have been that he was worried about someone who already was 2 years old. That idea. Now, as I said, they do come to worship. These magi come to worship. Now, the reason why I think this episode is funny, it ends in there's a horrible outcome to it. There's no doubt about it. But it's funny in this way, is that these magi come to the king, to the old king, asking about the new king. That never sets well with an old king. Just read the story of King Saul and King David in the Old Testament. You know, when a king's been deposed, they don't want to give up their spot. Well, Herod is upset when someone says, "Hey, where's the new king, king?" It's kind of bothersome to him. So he wants to eradicate this. And if you know anything about Herod, he was super paranoid about people trying to subvert his authority. He had people in his family killed. He had his own children killed at times. So he was a ruthless person. This is not... He did this without batting an eye, is what I mean. He was evil to his core. But anyway, so Herod discovers after this, he has his advisor. Well, no, they're Jewish. The religious leaders is what they are. So the chief priests and the scribes. So this tells us that Herod's governmental institution here, that his reign, is also connected to the some of the priestly people. Let's put that priestly line. And so he's connected to the priests, and he calls them in to ask about this, and they direct him to Micah 5:2. So they say, this is what Micah said in chapter 5, verse 2. Okay, so the thing about this Micah passage, well, first thing about Micah is that Micah is a prophet that worked in the southern kingdom of Judah and was a contemporary of Isaiah. In fact, both of them sat in a very interesting time in Israel's history, because the northern kingdom still is still around, and the southern kingdom is here, but they've split. But both of these prophets minister in a time where the northern kingdom is destroyed. Micah is a contemporary of the prophet Isaiah. They both ministered at the same time. It's interesting that one doesn't mention the other, but they do share a lot of similar messaging, especially the one about making your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks, and they both share that language. But anyway, Micah is interesting in that Bethlehem is the origin for David. Okay, so this is important. We need to remember where David came from. Well, he came from Bethlehem. And so in Micah, if you go back and read Micah chapter 5, well, just go back and read, it's not very long. You can read all of it very quickly. But in this context, in Matthew chapter 5, or Micah chapter 5, the worry is about Assyria. And so that's the same with Isaiah. And so Assyria is coming, and Micah's asking for deliverance from Assyria. And this delivering type of person is imagined here. And so, but initially it's talking about an event that's going on at that time in history, the Assyrian onslaught in this area. But now it's being used again in Matthew, and so we shouldn't be thinking like the idea of something has been fulfilled. In fact, that's a horrible translation of these kind of events. For instance, and let me bring this up real quick. Just excuse me for a second. So in Matthew chapter 2, verse 5, the ESV says, For so is written by the prophet. For thus it has been written through the prophet. Something like that, okay? And the point I'm trying to make is that this does not have to mean that it's being fulfilled. In fact, what I would say is, the fulfilled word that we always translate as fulfilled is not used there. There's a different word used. I'm pretty sure. Let me go back and check that again. Yeah, okay. So, this is an idea of something's being reused again. There's some kind of need for it to be reused again, something that connects the two together. This is an idea of something being filled more. So Old Testament passages always have some kind of purpose in the back, in their Old Testament era, whenever it was first spoken. It always has some kind of purpose then. But New Testament writers can come along and they can add to that storyline, add to the messaging, let's put it that way, and fit it into a context that's similar, maybe has a connective idea in a sense. So they fill it more is what the idea is. And so that's what Matthew does here. And Herod discovers that this messianic hope is supposed to come from the town of Bethlehem. So this is another way for Matthew to reinforce the connection between King David and Jesus. Remember, now Jesus did not come from the lineage of David. It's not possible because it would have been traced through the father's line. Joseph was not the father of Jesus. We know this clearly. To use today's language, we would say Joseph was the stepfather. That's about all we could say. He was not the physical father of Jesus. So there's no way for Jesus to be physically aligned with the lineage of David. The only way for it to happen is for Joseph to adopt Jesus. Now, it doesn't say this in the text, but it has to be assumed that this is what happens because there is no other way. And Matthew must think that the audience will get it because he never tells us how. But this reinforces this connection between Jesus and David, the town of Bethlehem. So now, Herod basically tries to deceive the Magi and tells them that he wants to go worship, which is it's a lie. And so the Magi leave. They go and find the baby. Now again, this has to be 1 to 2 years, probably more closer to 2 years after the birth of Jesus. So they're still in this town of Bethlehem. Probably, just the needs for Mary probably had a lot of needs. There was probably family members there that was able to help out with this new baby experience that she was having. This was her first baby, so it was probably a very stressful and a time, but also a time of great learning in her life about how to mother and things like that. But anyway, the Magi find the baby. Now, as I said before, there's a plurality. That's all we know. We know there has to be at least two. We don't know how many. Just because there are 3 gifts does not mean there were 3 wise men. Okay, so there's a plurality, but they give these 3 gifts: frankincense, myrrh, and gold. So that's what they do. Now, it's interesting that they are warned, because they are warned in a dream. So we have these dream messages all the way through chapters 1 and chapter 2. After the genealogy in chapter 1, we start to have these dream episodes where angels are speaking to Joseph or speaking to someone, okay? And so here they speak to the Magi. So an angel comes and tells the Magi not to go back to Herod, so they don't. Now that's going to make Herod very, very upset, okay? Now we can go to the next episode. So that's kind of where we leave that. So then you go to chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, the next episode. This is where Joseph is warned in a dream. He's warned in a dream to get out of Bethlehem and go down to Egypt. And so that's what he does. He finds out while he's down there that Herod dies. And so they return back to Palestine. And they use Hosea 11, verse 1. This is what Matthew uses. Out of Egypt I called my son. Now, if you go back and read Hosea chapter 11, it's very clear that it's talking about the Old Testament nation of Israel. Israel is first called the son of God. Go back and read Exodus. He's right off the bat. I mean, he tells Moses, "I'm going to bring my son out of Egypt," and so he calls Israel his son. So it's very clearly in Hosea that is talking about that old historic nation of Israel and bondage in the historic nation of country of Egypt that we know about from the book of Exodus and so forth. So, but this is a good. In fact, Hosea 11 is a good case study how we should try to understand the usage of an Old Testament passage in a New Testament context. It's so clear in this instance that this would be the paradigm that we could use on all others in most instances, I believe. Hosea 11 is a clear example of there was a purpose in Hosea that the prophet's talking about in that time frame. In fact, this is a historic event, the release of the Israelite people from bondage in Egypt. And so, an historic event, and Hosea talks about it. Now, in the New Testament times, a New Testament writer can come along and say he's going to use that again and fill it some more. And so, he's filling it again more, and now we have this, we're starting to get a connection between Jesus and Israel. This kind of idea, and this comparison is going to be very, very important. Israel failed God, Jesus will not. And so Jesus is going to end up becoming, as we continue through, there's going to be this mirroring of like the wilderness journeys. So we have this idea of Jesus, Israel coming out of Egypt, Jesus coming out of Egypt. Later on in chapter 4, guess what we're going to have? Jesus goes into the wilderness. Well, that's just like what the Israelite people did. They went into the wilderness. And it keeps on going. So I'll bring this up as we go, but this starts this motif of Jesus in comparison to Israel throughout. Again, that Hosea passage is just a great example of how to understand the usage of Old Testament passages in the New Testament. There's always relevance. Always relevance. And if the New Testament writers use it again, they're going to fill it more for a context, some kind of thematic connection that they're trying to make in that context, or maybe between the Old Testament context and this new context. We've got to remember we have New Covenant, Old Covenant in the background too in the Gospel of Matthew. So there's this lot of thematic threads being pulled here, I think. You go to the next section, it's 2:16 through 18, and again we go back in time now. So this is when Herod discovers he's been duped. So this is before Jesus and his family leave for Egypt. So Herod's found out that he's been duped, and so he's angry, and he orders the murder of the infants in Bethlehem 2 years and younger. This is a horrible, horrible event, and what's, kind of mind-boggling is that Matthew doesn't make much of it. He never says anything like Herod was a terrible person. He could have made a narrator's note. I don't know why he doesn't, but it's just no big deal. The problem because Herod is already known as being a ruthless person. So he's already done numerous despicable acts, so this is just in accord with his character in a sense. And he quotes from Jeremiah 31, verse 15, which if you go back and read Jeremiah, it's about the release of the Jewish people from Babylonian exile. People are starting to come back, and there's great joy, and it's like tears of joy. But in here, Matthew uses it in a way to talk about the sadness. And so Jeremiah 31 is not talking about this event necessarily. It's talking about an event that's going on in Judah's time, 600 years earlier. But he reuses it, and he's going to fill it with some more in order to express this sadness that the reader should feel about this event that happened under Herod's direction in Bethlehem. Horrible event. Now we go on to 2:19 through 23 and move forward again. Herod's dead now. And so this is why our calendar, the old BC AD system's off. Because Jesus wasn't born on 0. We know that to be true because Herod dies somewhere between 4 BCE and 6 BCE. So it'd be 4 to 6 years prior to what people thought. So the calendar was off. The Gregorian calendar was off. Come from Gregory the monk. But anyway, and so now people just talk about CE, Common Era, and BCE, before Common Era. It has nothing to do with trying to take God out of the calendar or anything like that. It's just that the calendar was off, and we know that from this passage right here. But anyway, Herod's dead. The message to return comes in a dream. They settle in Galilee at first, but they didn't go. They were going to go to Judea, but there was Herod's son was in charge there, so or Herod's family member. I'm pretty sure it's his son. And so they end up in going into Galilee. Again, this is telling us how Jesus got to Galilee. And then he closes with this very interesting idea about the Nazarene. There's a wordplay going on here. It's a wordplay in Hebrew. So Matthew expects his audience to understand something about this because it's not explained. So in Isaiah chapter 11, well, here's the idea. The idea is from the Hebrew word nazir, which means it's the idea of a wild offshoot or a branch or something like that, a stem that's shooting off of some kind of established growth. That's the idea, a nazir. Okay? Well, in Isaiah chapter 11, it talks about this kind of person, and it's called a Netzer. And so this idea is running as a messianic hope, in a sense, in parts of the Old Testament. And so Matthew wants to connect into this. He'll be called a Nazirene. And so that's what he's using here. He's trying to tie into this Nazir idea, the righteous branch that comes out of Isaiah chapter 11, that it became a messianic hope for so many Jewish people. So, all right, well, that's it. I'll stop right there. Next week we'll start in on chapter 3. I look forward to that, and I hope you found this episode here to be very, very helpful. Thank you. Have a great day. I'll see you on Sunday.